I want to say a quick word of thanks to Manisha Patel. I don't know if she's in the room, from the United Nations Association of Greater Philadelphia, for helping us with tonight's event. We really are delighted not only to be able to recognize the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but to be able to do so on the exact anniversary date of the momentous unveiling in 1948. What a time. Let us think back, a time of enormous creativity and genuine progress in world affairs was the late 1940s. To say it was a perfect time, of course. There were new threats from the bomb and the Cold War that emerged in those years. But still, in that time, there was created a new world order with a set of institutions and based on a set of principles embodied nowhere better or more consequentially than in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. A world order aimed at preventing a third world war and the sorts of previously unimaginable mass brutality that had come to define the first half of the 20th century. With all of the very real problems and continued suffering in the years since World War II and since the Universal Declaration, I think it's almost impossible for any of us who have lived our lives in the world created by the post-World War II world order to understand how bleak the human condition felt to people who had spent most of their lives in that first half of the 20th century and lived therefore through World War I and World War II and the great atrocities that occurred in those decades. So we want to look tonight at the record of the Universal Declaration. What has it accomplished? And of course, what remains to be accomplished under its terms. To lead off, we're going to have Professor Robert Groves, and following his overview, we're going to have a panel discussion including Dr. Yatende and Professor Paoletti. So with that, please join me in welcoming Bob Groves.
So I appreciate being here, and it's great to be here with the World Affairs Council because it's also their 70th anniversary. So they've been around and doing some stuff as well along the way with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I just want to make sure I mentioned that. I don't think it's been mentioned. So greeting fellow citizens of the world. So this is a birthday, a very significant birthday. And so I'm going to give kind of the positive, upbeat side of human rights to a certain extent tonight because it is a birthday and it is 70 years. Even though I'm well aware, as you are, of many of the many challenges we face all the time in the world. But thanks to the Universal Declaration, there's been a ton of progress made and the things that it's catalyzed as well. And we'll talk a little bit about that. The fundamental premise of the document, the UDHR, is we all have more in common than what divides us. So this presentation is dedicated in two ways. If I can get this to go. Now where'd it go? Got it. Okay. This dedication is dedicated in two different directions. One is to these guys, one of whom's my dad, the guy on your right with the pistol. And thanks to him and so many others who defeated fascism in World War II, we got, and the world got, an opening to create something called the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. On the back of that little photo that my mom got, it was about this big. It said, "Just back from combat, Luzon, Philippine Islands, 1945. So they look kind of badass, I think. It's also dedicated in another way. There we go. It's dedicated to the future. Happens to be my 2 grandchildren, but they're representative of all the young people in the world who we are here, all of us in this room, really partly as a matter of intergenerational justice and looking at the world going forward. So thanks to Dad, and wishing the best for these guys as we move forward in the world of making human rights more real for everybody. So how many of you were ever taught in your life in school, any of your formal schooling, about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Please raise your hands. Wow. Just taught about it. You don't count, you're from Holland. I know you're a ringer, Christian. But I have taught this class 6 or 7 years of adults at Temple, and I've probably had that many people, which is about 5 or 6, raise their hand in all those years saying they were taught at all about the Universal Declaration, which says something unfortunate about our educational system and something that's a gap. Human rights is a term that's thrown around a lot these days, and frankly, it seems more prevalent than ever in the news that I can remember, the word human rights. But really, what are our human rights? Well, tonight I don't have time to go through all 30 of them, but you do have at your place a booklet with them all in there. I hope you'll read them through at least once in their entirety at some point soon. And when you do it, think about which one of those rights you'd be willing to give up or have your kids or your family and friends give up. Because I don't think you'll come up with something. If you do, let me know. Also want to point out that there's a distinction between having rights and enjoying rights. So we all have these 30 rights, is the assertion. However, not everyone enjoys these rights, but we got them. So that's a distinction to keep in mind when thinking about human rights. So I want to point out that in terms of the long view of history, I really like this quote by Arnold Toynbee, a British historian. And what he's pointing out is that the endeavor that the world took on, as Craig alluded to in the beginning, after World War II, was the first time in human history that the world tried to figure out a way, in a practical way, that everybody could share in human rights and well-being. Nobody had really ever tried to do that before. The League of Nations, which was a brief effort after World War I, kind of crashed and burned for a whole lot of reasons. But nobody's ever done it successfully since then. So the 20th century, we need to be thankful for that. And this day, December 10th, 1948, maybe around this time, led by Eleanor Roosevelt, after a 2-year effort to put together this declaration, the United Nations voted 48 in favor, 8 abstentions to pass the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So that's why it's a birthday, and it's something to be recognized every December 10th. Because human rights are really inescapable. They're about who we were, how do we treat people in the past, who we are today, how do we treat each other now, and who we'll be in the future. And you can look at almost anything in that framework of who we were, who we are, and who we will be in terms of human rights. Because for most of human history, what's been considered the natural order of things were things like slave labor, superstitious killings, and human sacrifice based on superstitions, sharp class and race divisions, discrimination against women, to put it mildly. That's all been the natural order of things for most of human history. And under these conditions, the victims of human rights, that is most people ever born, at least up until, I don't know, 1900, maybe? Most people ever born have been human rights abuse victims because Whatever the king said, whatever the leader said goes, and that person felt no accountability or compunction to feel accountable outside of his or her country. So there's 8 basic questions that the Universal Declaration helps us answer about human rights. Age-old questions. Does human life have value? What's the nature of human beings? What's the relationship of human beings to each other? Do we have duties or responsibilities to each other or not? What's the relationship between duties and rights? Are there such things as natural laws and natural rights? What's the nature of these natural rights, and to whom do these rights apply? Those are things the Universal Declaration gets us to address and comes out in favor of all of that. So morally speaking, human rights are not created by a country's laws, not at all. Human rights precede and provide a moral foundation for a country's laws. The laws should be written based on human rights. And that's been the concept since 1948. And a measuring stick for a country or leader's actions through the Universal Declaration. I think important points to keep in mind. So, what are some of the light bulb, well, let me talk about the 4 waves of rights first. If you just start in the 18th century for the moment, you can see 4 waves. Basic civil rights for men in the 18th century, expansion of male suffrage in the 19th century, social and economic rights for all, the welfare state in the 20th century, and international protection of human rights in the 21st century. So some light bulb moments. Somehow along the way, people started waking up in the morning and thinking about things like they never had before. For instance, in human rights history, the 17th and 18th centuries was the time that people started thinking that kings and queens might not be divine and they might not be endowed with unlimited power. Now, they were thinking these things, but if they said it out loud, they were considered freaking crazy. And everything you're going to see on here, the same thing happened when people first started to think and then say these things out loud. 19th century. Slavery, might not be part of the natural order. Slavery actually might be morally wrong. People started to think that in the 19th century. Women might not be inferior to men. It's crazy stuff. But they started to say this out loud. Exploited workers should not be excluded from social and economic justice. 19th century thinking, crazy as it is. 20th and 21st century. Racial discrimination and apartheid are wrong. Colonial empires might not be inevitable. Really goofy, crazy stuff, people would say. Indigenous peoples are full human beings with rights. People started to actually believe this stuff. Children, disabled, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender individuals are full human beings with rights. People were actually talking about this in the 20th and 21st century. And genocide and torture are ethically reprehensible. These are Bob Grove's picking out some light bulb moments in the history of human rights, but I think it's worth noting, things weren't always the way we see them today. Our Bill of Rights of the United States and our revolution here is a great moment in the history of human rights. And for its time, it was an incredible advance. Our Bill of Rights as we have it today is not nearly as expansive as that declaration you have. What we do have, and the UDHR has, are civil and political rights in our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. Things like free speech, free religion, and voting, and fair trials. But The UDHR goes well beyond in social and economic rights, education, healthcare, housing, leisure time, and a whole bunch of other things. So that's kind of what are the fundamental differences between the global and the US approach. Two basic tensions all the time in the realm of human rights. One is between human rights and national security. Sometime in the early part of this century, we felt very insecure, around 2001. And a couple of things we've done and are still doing in one case. We started torturing people, the United States. Finally, we're called on that by our own representatives a few years ago. But a lot of torture happened on our watch of our enemies, people we thought were enemies. And as we speak, we still have a prison in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, where people are being held without charge and with no trial happening for years. That's a violation of human rights. That's happening right now because we feel a national security threat that we felt we had to do something about. Another tension with human rights that's ongoing is human rights and national sovereignty. As I said earlier, people were never held accountable outside their own boundaries of their country. Now you see it happening, or talked about at least, a lot. The whole Jamal Khashoggi thing with Saudi Arabia, there are people in the world trying to hold the Saudis accountable in a way for that kind of activity that wouldn't have happened before the concept of human rights was fully out there. But there's lots of other examples. If you look at the Nuremberg trials and the Tokyo trials, that kind of opened the door to accountability for human rights violations outside the boundaries of one's particular country. One of the great things that's happened from the UDHR is the creation of various courts. Some are regional, some are in country, and where people are being held to account for actions they had taken. One of the best ones is the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. It's a mouthful, but they've racked up about 161 convictions for people that were involved in war crimes and genocide during that conflict in former Yugoslavia in the 90s. Another in Rwanda for the genocide, and there are other courts. So those tensions, though, are always present and probably always will be as long as we have nation states. And you might have heard recently about the Global Magnitsky Act being talked about, which is a U.S. law that was passed in 2012, where the United States can officially apply, and is thinking about doing this. Some people want this to happen with the Saudi prince, the current Saudi leader. It authorizes our government to sanction human rights offenders, freeze their assets, and ban them from entering the United States. It's been applied to 35 individuals by the United States government since 2012 when it was passed. So that's a kind of thing that flows out of the Universal Declaration, the concept of that kind of a law. So there's been some progress, which we'll quickly look at since World War II, and you can probably pick out a lot of other things. These are my choices of certain things to highlight. Nuremberg trials, the UN founded. Amnesty International was founded in 1961. Hopefully you've heard of them. It was really one of the first times people started to get paid to get up in the morning and go fight for human rights. That happens on a large scale at this point in time. Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act in the U.S., 1964-65, big human rights achievements. Another bunch of people getting paid to fight for human rights, Human Rights Watch, 1988. The Americans with Disabilities Act, to me, is a tremendous example of human rights. And most of you in this room remember days when people with disabilities didn't even come close to getting around the way they can now, and those curb cuts really help, along with all those ramps and a whole bunch of other things. And that's a model for the world, that particular law. And these international criminal tribunals that I mentioned. Apartheid ends, Nelson Mandela elected, International Criminal Court is a whole other aspect of what's flowed out of the Universal Declaration. International treaties from 1949 to 2008 on chemical weapons, cluster bombs, protecting civilians from different types of weapons, these kinds of things. Again, a global approach to things that never was tried until after World War II in a serious way. Things were started, but these flowed out of the Universal Declaration. There's a regional councils on in Europe, Africa, and the Americas on human rights that deal with various types of cases. Gay marriage magically became legal in the Netherlands in 2001. Shockingly, it's now legal in at least 26 countries, only 17 years later. That's a huge advance no one ever thought was possible not very long ago. And finally, the UN itself continues a very successful partnership with many countries around the world in Sustainable Development Goals and the Millennial Development Goals. And so in terms of this progress, I like this quote from Steven Pinker in a recent book, but it kind of gives you a baseline, and human rights progress is a big part of the reason why we're in this position. The richest country in the world 2 centuries ago, the Netherlands, the average life expectancy was 40. It wasn't above 45 in any country, and today life expectancy in the poorest country in the world is 54. So, and nobody is under 45. So we're better off no matter what's happening out there right now. We're doing better. And one more. If you had to choose a moment in history to be born, anybody in this room, any moment in history, you're not born yet, and you didn't know ahead of time who you would be, and you couldn't choose what country you were going to be born in, or what race, or what gender, you just had to choose blindly what moment in all of human history you'd want to be born. You choose now, no matter what's going on out there, because any individual in this world today, anywhere, has got a better chance of thriving and surviving than they ever did before. And I agree with Barack Obama on that one. That's who it's from, 2016. Trust me, it's better right now. The irony of human rights progress. Human rights movement is essentially a movement to make invisible problems visible. That's what they do. That's what those people getting paid to get up in the morning and do research and write journalistic articles are all about. The positive intended impact of that is that more people's rights are recognized and more victims are saved and more people are held to account. And that happens. But another thing that happens is a negative unintended effect. Because by certain things coming out, people sometimes get discouraged and they feel like the world's getting worse. But that is definitely part of what we have to deal with, because sometimes things that are painful to hear mean that people are being held to account who have never been held to account before, and people who have been victimized are not going to be victimized in the future, or at least less so. And two very immediate, the Me Too movement and sex abuse in the Catholic Church are examples of things that may be painful for a lot of people to hear, may make people feel, oh, the world's getting worse. Well, no, actually, this is what's happening. People are being held accountable who never were before, and victims are going to be far less. Come on, you can do it. So, Bob Grove's off-the-cuff suggestions for U.S. leadership in human rights. These are things that have already happened. We began to respond in an incredibly positive way in the early 2000s to the global AIDS crisis. Started in this case by George Bush. Barack Obama expanded it. I frankly don't know the exact funding of it at this moment, but I know it's still out there. tremendous positive things have happened on the AIDS front globally since that time. And that's a partnership with all kinds of organizations and individuals and a lot of US dollars. Also, we did have a terrific response, which we kind of forget about, to the global Ebola crisis in 2014 and 2016, led by our government, which saved probably millions of lives because of the way we were able to mobilize around the world with other groups and with the UN, but with our leadership and money to save people's lives and to put a stop to that. My suggestions, some current opportunities for the US to lead. Strong support of the Paris Climate Change Treaty. A ton of things we could do there. I'm sure everyone's aware of that. Obviously, we're not doing that now. The global refugee crisis, we could do a ton of work as a leader with the UN and the EU and others, way more than we're doing now. The UN has actually got a framework for this to happen as we speak that could be used, and they are trying to move ahead, but we could add a whole lot to that in a very positive way. There we go. Comprehensive immigration reform in the United States and Central American aid, big time for programs that work, would do a heck of a lot to help the problem and the challenge of migration from Central America. We could be doing that in terms of leadership. The resolution of the North and South Korean conflicts is an important issue. Resolve the war in Yemen, a horror show as we speak, and resolve the Syrian civil war. There are just some things that the United States could do a lot more on, in my opinion, that would be a real leadership in human rights. And finally, my unsolicited advertisement for a really good guy who's coming to the Penn Pearly World House next semester. His name is Zaid Rad Al Hussein, the former High Commissioner for Human Rights. He's a really good speaker. They have a lot of free programs out there. Check out Pearly World House. And he's a great person and well worth hearing. That's what I got. Thank you.
Okay, if we could ask all three of our guests to come up. Okay, so we have so many things we can pick up on with Bob's talk. I think we'll go in a whole bunch of different directions. I want to start this way. So one of the great changes since the adoption of the Declaration is that there is essentially no public figure on Earth that publicly speaks against the concept of universal rights. I'm not talking about the practice that people adhere to. I'm talking about rhetoric, right? So the notion that there are universal rights is no longer, I think, challenged as a concept. And then what goes on behind the scenes is attempted to be explained away or denied, right? So the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia doesn't come out and say, I have a right to treat a citizen of my country, Khashoggi, in this way. He's a dissident. He doesn't have the right to oppose me. He says it didn't happen, or it happened this other way, or somebody else did it, or tries to hide it. So I guess my question is, how much does that change actually matter? The rhetorical change versus the reality of what goes on behind. Does the change in rhetoric actually improve behavior, at least to some degree? We'll start, Dr. Yatani.
I don't think that change in rhetoric actually changes things, because what we're looking at are actions. So the face value is that, yes, we support human rights, but if your actions are not, is contrary to what you're saying, then you're basically saying that I do not support human rights. So if you have laws and policies and the way you treat marginalized groups in your society, and it is not a reflection of what is in the tenets of the UDHR, then you are speaking volumes. And I think with actions of world leaders and some of their inability to uphold what is in the UDHR, it basically says volumes to the international community on where they stand when it comes to supporting human rights.
Oh, I have so much to say.
Go ahead.
So as a precursor, I'll just say that I, in addition to working on human rights, I do direct representation of individuals in immigration proceedings, and am deeply enmeshed in the world of immigration. And so I absolutely agree, actions matter. And the United States' leadership has been marred by a history of exceptionalism where actually we don't seem to recognize the rights contained in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, right? We are the only country that hasn't ratified that. We are one of 6 countries that hasn't ratified the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. And so I think while that may be an action and we say women are equal, in reality, I think that is a form of speech. And I think that that words and rhetoric do matter. More often, the impact is seen in the negative than in the positive, as we see now in the area of migration, right? And the complete and total dehumanization of immigrants, which is something that we have seen over history with the African American population, and now with the immigrant population more generally, and the impact that dehumanization of individuals and the othering of individuals has is tremendous. Now, whether shifting that rhetoric back to no human being is illegal will actually make the sort of positive strides forward that we need to see, I think we have to start somewhere, and I wouldn't sort of still be in this field if I didn't think that we had somewhere we could go.
I'd just like to add that we have a baseline to judge and work from that didn't exist before. So that's a good thing, but it's got to get beyond rhetoric, and it does in different ways at different times, but not quickly sometimes.
Okay, so that goes to the question of the value of the Declaration, right? It's obviously, it was never intended to be a cure-all instantaneously, and of course, no document could. But I hear all of you saying that while it matters, it creates a baseline to lay out these principles, that's only a fairly limited value if we don't get good enforcement. Okay, so that's sort of one. So I want to continue with sort of the value, right, and how we judge this anniversary, and say that in some ways, maybe things are getting even worse in recent years, where we have now in China, in Russia, in Iran, in a number of places around the world of real consequence, we have a greater willingness than we've seen in recent decades to not only not practice human rights as they're contained in the Universal Declaration, but to actually argue in the world of ideas that this whole construct is somehow Western imperialism, and that these countries have their own culture, their own sense of what matters, their own sense of values, and that to make an affirmative argument that their authoritarian systems are providing a better quality of life for people than what they describe as sort of chaos and moral degeneration in the West. So where do we go, right, when we have these rising authoritarian powers that are willing to challenge even the idea of global norms on human rights? Start with you.
It becomes very difficult because it's almost like walking a fine line. Yes, the United Nations has had criticism that it's some form of the advancement of neo-imperialism, that after decolonization, so the emergence of all of these global institutions after World War II were just kind of the Western power stretching its hands out in a different form of trying to maintain still control. But at the same time, I think the United Nations and its agencies have gone great lengths in a sense to understand culture and to understand the importance of human rights and culture and the respect of culture. So it is someone's human right to say, you know what, I'd rather veil myself, right? It is someone's human right to say, I'd rather keep this cultural practice, even if we look at the human rights, the UDHR, it may, in a sense, walk a fine line of sort of not aligning to what is actually outlined in there. So I think, in a sense, it's finding that balance that has been quite difficult over time. But I would give the UN credit for trying to have some form of cultural expertise with the various cultures and beliefs and value systems and practices that sometimes do go against what is outlined in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. So I think that balance is what we are struggling with, this notion that what the world espouses is somehow some form of a Western ideal that infringes on the rights and cultural beliefs of others around the world. And I think they recognize that. And I think that's one of their values. And for autocratic regimes, that's just a great sort of play. Right. It's a wonderful play for them to say, look, don't worry about the UDHR. It's Western ideals. We have a different cultural belief systems. We should live our life the way we want to live it. But at the same time, you cannot use that argument when clearly there are human rights violations being made. Clearly, where your citizens are speaking out and saying, look, you are infringing on my rights. I am not being able to live up to my full potential as a citizen in your country. These things are clear in a sense. So again, that argument it's like waning thin at this point.
Yeah, and I think, right, I'm a lawyer, right? So everything I think about is, it depends, right? It's all subject to interpretation. And so then it becomes a question of who's doing the interpretation and how are they doing it, right? Who are they listening to? Who are they hearing from? And if we look at the UDHR and its basic grounding in the right to dignity and the principle of equality and non-discrimination, are all voices being heard? Are all voices being heard equally? And are we recognizing human agency, right? And so there is the risk, and it is perpetuated in the human rights movement. It has gotten much better of the savior notion, right? We will go and save, and we will go to any country in Africa, and we've developed this great Civil Rights Act and this great whatever, and we're going to introduce our laws into your country. And they don't work, right? And so it's thinking about how do we incorporate the voices of the people about whom, right? The expression, nothing about us without us. And thinking about how that is done. And I agree. I think the UN has gotten agencies within the UN. I think it's important not to talk about the UN as a single monolithic, right? But individuals and agencies within the UN have tried, and human rights organizations have gotten better about this as well.
And I just want to add that when this document was written, it wasn't just Eleanor and three white guys from the UK, France, and the United States in a room who wrote it over 2 years. It was a very diverse set of people around the world who had input and involvement in that. Could it have been better? Sure. But it was really, really far-flung, and the Global South had a big part in its development. So, and there's a book I gave you as a reference in the handout, The World Made New, which kind of goes into that in a pretty good way.
All right, so let me stay with this question of what is universality, right? President Obama, one of the last trips he took as president was in Africa, And he carried with him contemporary American definitions of human rights, which obviously include gay rights. And there was a lot of pushback, public pushback, from African leaders saying that may be okay for you, it's not okay here. So our own definition of human rights changes. Gay rights were not considered part of the pantheon in the United States, even fairly recently. And yet, we're now sort of trying to export them, if you will, under the notion of universality. So I want you to stay with this question of how do you find a way to make it fit in places where people may not agree in terms of their own cultural heritage?
Well, that's very difficult. I was born here. My parents are from Nigeria, where there are laws on homosexuality, right? If you are found to be gay, you can be imprisoned. You cannot publicly show what they call homosexuality. There are strict laws on that. Now, with that being said, it becomes very difficult when we talk about sovereignty, right? And we talk about countries being autonomous unto their own. That's where, again, we walk that fine line. And those are some of the criticisms that, of course, can be alleged against United Nations, that we cannot force countries, right, to sort of mainstream what is set up in the UDHR into their federal laws or into their constitution. What we can do is recommend these provisions and these mandates, although there are certain treaties that are legally binding, but still yet that becomes very difficult, because then we're talking about there's certain cultural norms, right, that are part of certain cultures and traditions that make it very difficult for the work of UDHR and its agencies to bring this idea of universality there. And I think that's one of the difficulties that we are facing, especially in African countries where one of the main marginalized groups are the LGBTQ community. They cannot show their own sort of sexuality and embrace that and be who they are. They have to live in hiding or seek asylum somewhere else where they can be who they are. And the UN knows this, right? We can pinpoint the countries that do not support these rights. We can provide whatever moral pressure we can, and we can sort of point the finger. But again, it goes back to that idea of sovereignty. What else are the other alternatives that we can use to leverage to ensure that marginalized groups within society, especially on the African continent, have the same rights that other Western countries have? And I think that's just always the argument that, look, these are Western ideals. You cannot force this idea of Westernization upon us. But I think there's a clear distinction of Westernization and what is a human right, right? Being able to live who you are, being able to express yourself as a full individual. And again, that is still under attack.
And I think one of the sort of core tenets of the Obama administration's foreign policy and human rights was the notion of free and open and full and robust engagement with civil society. And that was really core because it was sort of the way in which they were modeling opening up civil society spaces, right? Because it is the ground up transformations are the ones that are going to last, right? And so when it went through its first universal periodic review process, it actually got a little bit of a shock because it said, well, we're going to hold these town halls across the country and hold these listening sessions and hear what you have to say about human rights and where we can improve in this country. And they heard voices that they had not heard before. But they listened, right? I can't say that they implemented all of the recommendations that we sought, but they listened. And it was this notion that we have to create the spaces for everybody to talk and have a place to speak. And you get a decision from the Supreme Court. We have Brown v. Board of Education, right? The Supreme Court speaks from on high, but we have not dealt with issues of racial segregation in our school districts yet. So there has to be a way to look at these things from the top and from the bottom both, so that they're mutually supportive.
Just to clarify, there is a universal periodic review process that the UN goes through with every country every 5 years, where, as Sarah's referring to, there are community meetings, for instance, in the US on human rights issues, and there was one recently completed for the United States. So there is that level of data gathering and some level of accountability. Again, it comes down to what kind of leadership in any given country. But I guess the thing about this that, always is a tough call, but we know it when we see it sometimes, is when the cultural and religious practices are simply, covers for people being merely self-serving. And that's always the challenge, but that's happening, and that's something that need to be challenged as best as possible.
Sure.
And I always say that what governments don't do, the civil society organizations do. So in countries where the governments are unwilling to create laws that protect everyone in society, that's where you see civil society organizations step up and bridge that gap. So when we start to see civil society organizations suppressed in a country, we have a really big problem, because those are the people that do the grassroots activism, that speak on the behalf of those who the government is not even recognizing. So once we start to see the point where these civil society organizations are suppressed, where they're killed, where they're jailed, then we really get into a problem where now there's a situation where we're having more of a conversation of, now, what do we do? Right? How can we get this country to work? How can we get its citizens to be recognized? And now you're in an uphill battle. So CSOs are extremely important when it comes to human rights.
Okay, so I want to stick with the sort of theme of other perspectives. So for the moment, I'm going to play the part of the president of China. And the president of China, I think, has said, maybe not in this clear sense, but you can piece together a view in which he would say the Communist Party of China is the greatest human rights organization in the history of the world, because our policies have lifted more people out of miserable poverty than any other governing body in the history of the world. Fundamental human dignity, the positive rights of the Declaration: shelter, food, clothing, access to education, access to medical care. We've provided more of that to more people, just numbers, than any other institution in the history of the world. So anybody who challenges our authority, or who says, yeah, but you don't do free speech, you don't do these other things, you're just missing the boat. What's your response?
Right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are so many examples where that's just false, but there's also, it pushes us into the very dangerous arena of creating a hierarchy of rights. And the United States and much of the Western world has fallen victim of that, where we have prioritized civil and political rights and the other countries have prioritized economic rights. And they are so intertwined and interconnected, and to allow ourselves to try to provide a rank order of rights allows for then this sort of pointing that, well, you this, you that, and we never get anywhere, right? And then I think it also comes back to what is civil society saying, right? What are they saying? Are they saying, thank you, China, for making sure that I have a roof over my head? Or are they saying, well, I have a roof over my head, but, right, any day I could be in an unnamed jail somewhere and right, isolated from my family and from the world. So.
Yeah, and I think I said the number of sweatshops, the number of the labor issues that China is facing right now, and I think because they play such a role in the global economy, right? There's a tendency for people to turn away, right? For people to sort of kind of, okay, as long as we are still in our dealings and you are producing and manufacturing a majority of what the world consumes, we may turn a blind eye to what's going on in China. But the thing of the matter is that are the civil society organizations being forced to say thank you? That's the major question. Do they have the autonomy to say thank you and really feel that way? And in the world that we live in, where capitalism, again, kind of sometimes rear its ugly head and we are forced to sort of focus on the dollar in the expense of people, I think China still has a long way to go in terms of what they define as being free. So if I give you economic freedom, and I don't give you political or social or cultural freedom, are you really free? So how do they define actual freedom, and what do they define human rights? And I think with human rights, we have a tendency to put a dollar figure on it, right? So you are free because you have a certain amount in your bank account. You're able to buy a house. You're able to follow the Maslow hierarchy of needs, but that's not the only thing that constitutes human rights. It's not, and again, we oftentimes do turn a blind eye because of their global standing in world economy.
And just to add to that, I mean, China is, to me, the great anomaly of all of human history. They're, as we speak, they're the greatest polluters on Earth and the greatest developers of green energy on Earth. Millions of people did come out of poverty. And down the road, I believe it's the Uyghurs, the Muslim group, is being herded off into concentration camps. So, they're a unique situation of the highest order. But I agree that, the hierarchy of rights just doesn't fly when we're talking about universal rights. And again, who would want to give up what they give up to do that?
Okay, so let's turn to Russia. But stay with the idea of the hierarchy of rights. What is your feeling about a country where you can make a good case that the majority of the citizens, perhaps the overwhelming majority of the citizens, have actually made a choice in terms of the hierarchy of rights, right? So President Obama used to joke all the time about Vladimir Putin's approval rating. And how high it is. It's been as high as 80%, right? In reputable sort of independent polling. But even if you question it, the guy's popular. It's hard to argue the guy's not popular, right? And yet we know that he's repressive, that he kills journalists, that at political opponents there's no real elections. What if the majority of the people of a country make a choice, and that choice is, if I'm reasonably well off economically, better than my parents were, and if I feel that and I have a sort of sense of pride about my nation, that I'm okay with trading what we consider to be the political side of human rights. What then?
Human rights was not created for the majority, right? Human rights apply to all individuals, regardless of where they fit within that majority. And so I don't care if it's two people in the country, right? If their rights are being violated, their rights are being violated, right? And I think that's the notion of the universality of human rights. It's the notion of all persons that introduces the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And if you allow for, but the majority, then where have we gone, right? I mean, it was the whole reason for having this framework and for being able to recognize every individual as a possessor of fundamental human rights, regardless of the majority's interest.
And I think, with Vladimir Putin, there's what we call, political science, there's like three forms of legitimacy, right? And we look at the personality cult. They have what we call these personalities, right, where people oftentimes follow, right, and that's the individual. We're not talking about the laws and the policy that they put in place, but who that person is as an individual. We've seen it in Chile, we've seen it in other countries around in Africa, where they may have oppressive policies, right? They may wield with a heavy hand, but they are loved and adored. Same thing with Idi Amin. Idi Amin was still a dictator in Uganda, but he was loved and he was adored. People would flank to him. They would follow him, but he was known to be one of the most ruthless dictators in the world, and is what we call a personality cult. So I think we shouldn't confuse the fact that they may be in love with the individual, but not in love with the policies and the laws that are in place. And I think there's a separation for that. And then sometimes these leaders are the representation of these laws and policies. And so I don't necessarily think that they're in love in terms of the actual country itself. I think they're in love with that individual and that leader, because there's some form of an aura and a personality around it. And there's been a lot of work around personality cults and what that is about. So I think that there needs to be sort of that differentiation.
The only other thing I would add is that despite whatever popularity, I know that he's also getting some resistance and pushback regarding things like old age pensions and the corruption of the country, and people are upset about some of that economic situation there. It's very hard for it to emerge in the Western press. I always feel like Vladimir Putin's like the fastest guy on his feet in the world and just uses each new situation to, somehow distract his populace from what's really going on. But at some point in time, 15, 20 years, the guy's not going to be there, and then what? So, yeah.
So perhaps the greatest possible abuse of human rights is genocide. And maybe the greatest inspiration for the Universal Declaration are the genocides of World War II. We've all heard the slogan "Never again," but the reality is that there's been agains and agains and agains since World War II and since the Universal Declaration. So my question is about enforcement mechanisms, right? Bob talked about the courts that have brought some folks from Cambodia, Rwanda, Bosnia. That's not much solace for the victims, right? And it doesn't stop or prevent, even if there's some degree of punishment after the fact. What can the world do? What should the United States do, in your view, to make an end to genocide a real thing?
I just want to say I happened to read a book by Catherine Sinkink at Harvard called Evidence for Hope, Human Rights in the 21st Century. And she does claim in there that the courts that you're referring to there is data and research showing that there is a preventive impact from those courts in terms of behavior and less bad behavior going forward. So there are people looking at that who, the courts are by no means perfect, but they are definitely, I think they're having some preventive impact. And clearly some people have been brought to justice. So, and maybe some people haven't behaved badly because they're afraid of a court, what a court might do to them.
We have the responsibility to protect treaty. So, but that has had a lot of criticism, and that was supposed to sort of be our, I don't know if this is a shining light in the sense that would stop and end genocide sort of in its tracks, where countries would come together and they would literally vow to protect citizens who cannot be protected by their government. But again, that has had its issues, the sovereignty issues, the economic cost, that the military cost that it costs to for countries to intervene. The Rwandan genocide was, and even what's going on in Syria are great examples of the failures of R2P. But what can the United States do in terms of ensuring that there's not another genocide, or trying to avert another genocide from happening? It's not only the United States' responsibility too, and I think that's a lot of the arguments and the criticism that's been made, is that why why should it only be the US's responsibility? And for many reasons, I can understand that halt, but at the same time, we're almost getting to a point where this idea of responsibility to protect is actually on a decline. We are seeing far more civil wars that are rising, and I think countries are questioning, well, is this in my, and I think they've always been questioning this, is this in my self-interest to get involved, right? I think Rwanda was that case where it really was not in the United States self-interest to get involved, right? But the argument is that these are people. Saving human lives should be in everyone's self-interest, and that is the actual argument. But that argument is not necessarily holding up as it should. And what is the other mechanism to get countries to say, look, even if it's not in your self-interest, if there's no oil, if there's no resources that are there for you to sort of protect, that human lives are more important than these natural resources. But yet I don't know, and I kind of want to probably hear my fellow panelists on this. Are we getting to a point where human lives are much more important than the natural resources that need to be protected?
That's a great question. The problem with genocide prevention as it's been carried out is that it waits until the genocide has begun, and it is very costly, right? It's like you wait, you've got all of the symptoms, you ignore the symptoms, you continue to ignore the symptoms, and you end up in the emergency room, right? And the preventative medicine would have been much cheaper and much easier. And right. And so then it is the cost of engaging is really high. So there, what can the United States do? It goes to, we can lead by example, right? Do we want to hold our own tribunals for genocide of Native Americans in the United States? Do we want to hold tribunals for genocide of the African population in the United States? Do we want to recognize sort of our own actions and how they have led to what are arguably genocides? Do we want to look at the rhetoric of this president and the way in which he dehumanizes in others and refers to people as animals, which then allows for the killing of people to proceed because they are not recognized as people, right? And so until we're willing to sort of step up at that beginning stage where it is the name calling and the dehumanizing and the othering, which is how the Rwandan genocide started, right? If you look at the rhetoric around Charlottesville and the rhetoric around leading into the Rwandan genocide, it's frightening. And so we've got to be willing to sort of claim that, own it, name it, and push forward.
On the topic of genocide and things related, I agree with what's being said by my other panelists. I just want to point out two books, though, because I don't think that the scale of what using the word genocide is, we've even come close since World War II. And check out Steven Pinker's new book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism, and Progress, and a book by a guy named Hans Rosling called Factfulness. They both came out very recently, and they get the best available data and show you where we actually stand on all these measures, including genocide. And we're actually, by their count, doing far better than we ever did before in the history of the world. Doesn't mean there aren't horrible things happening. Believe me, I can curse with the best of them at the TV screen, as my wife can tell you, who's here. But it's really, there is some progress there that I think is partly due to the international institutions and some of the things that came into place after World War II.
I'm going to ask one last question, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And I do this sort of by way of, devil's advocate. I'm going to throw out a thesis. The thesis would be that in terms of American policy towards human rights in the world, that we've had this polarization that prevents effective action. So the thesis would argue, on the left, We've had lots of concern about human rights, genuine kind of moral commitment to human rights, but we've had an equal aversion to the use of American power, particularly military power. On the right, we've had an embrace of U.S. power, an embrace of U.S. military capability, but a belief that foreign policy was much more about economic interests and other values and not about human rights. And that indeed, if you look at Cambodia, if you look at Rwanda, if you look at Syria, the only way to have affected human rights really on a significant way would have been to do it with force, with power. And therefore, you would have had to have married the concern of the left and the concern of the right into something different. It's not like that something different doesn't have a name and hasn't had a school of thought. There was a brief time when the United States had what a guy who used to call himself the acting president of the United States. That was Josiah Bartlett on the West Wing. There's a West Wing episode in which President Bartlett gives a State of the Union address about declaring the United States to have a doctrine of humanitarian intervention against genocide. But that only happened in the fictitious world. It didn't happen in the real world. So my question is, how would each of you, from your own political points of view, feel about an American doctrine of humanitarian intervention in situations like Syria, Rwanda, Cambodia?
It's you know why it's difficult, because from the outside they will argue and say this doctrine is just trying to protect America's interest, and that we may be infringing on the rights of another country or their sovereignty by going in, because we've done this in Somalia, we've done this before, and the results were not as great, right? Black Hawk Down is a movie that sort of was so it wasn't that great. So in a sense, we didn't really have this doctrine, but we had this idea. And we followed with that idea that didn't have that many positive results. So by creating a formal doctrine, I think there would be a lot of, pushback. I honestly think there would be pushback from the international community, who have speculation and wary eyes of what is the actual motive and intention behind this doctrine. And I think that's where we get in the sort of that balancing act. And I always say, we live in a polarized time, but the fact of the matter is that, look, if we're able at some point to meet in the middle, right, and to understand both sides and their needs and their desires, because at the end of the day, the main desire and needs is really the American people, right? That's the most important. But now we're in sort of an isolationist kind of ideology and framework in which the government is in and wants to be concerned about what's going on in our own backyard and not necessarily international policing and what's going on around the world. But I don't think the two are separate silos. I honestly think that there's a point to meet in the middle where you are focused on what is going on in your own country, but also have an eye on what goes around in the world. We live in a globalized world, right? We live in a globalized community that what happens in another part of the world can affect us here in the United States. So again, because of national security and global security, we can't actually ignore what is going on around the world. Now, we just have to figure out a balanced way and a well-intentioned way that not only protects us here in the United States, but also reaffirms the tenets of the UHDR, while also still protecting and supporting and respecting the sovereignty of other countries. I think that's how we put all of that together. You have to wait to be seen, I would say.
I don't think there's any magic answer. There's a couple of thoughts. To me, if you're referring to a humanitarian intervention that includes a military intervention plus humanitarian, the bad way to do that was the Iraq War, where we lied, and in like split seconds, it felt like we had troops there. And of course, if you do something based on lies to begin with, it ain't going to work, and we know what we got. However, personally, I could see where if we had a Bartlett, Josiah Bartlett doctrine, which required a substantial amount of debate in terms of certain amount of time and required involvement with the United Nations to do something like that as in a formal way, some kind of requirement that linked those things. So it's not based on lies and it's linked with the UN and it can't be done like, in 8 days or something. I mean, that would be, depending on the situation, that would be my gut level response. We might have to pay for it.
That would be a big question. Yes, it would.
Which comes back, I think, to my earlier comment, right? These conflicts don't just spring up overnight. And it really does go to the importance of the UN and the value that the UN can play and the importance of full and open and honest engagement within the UN, right? And so sort of recognizing what is happening, knowing what is happening, not being caught off guard. And then I think on the piece of humanitarian intervention, I think the first question is always, who's asking us to help, right? And that goes to sort of what are the interests that are being met. Is there a community in need in the country that is asking us for help and saying, we need you to come because we are being massacred, right? Or what we face this, right? And so what is the legitimacy? Who's making the decisions for the intervention?
Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, we're going to take some questions from all of you. Please.
Not all of us can be like Bob Rose and do the right thing for the right reason. Bill Clinton's statement that I love, he said, we got to give up on saying the problem with us is them. Maybe you guys, some of you can say that because it's the right thing to say. You're not going to talk about each other like that. But I'd like you guys to talk about what is the function in a world of scarce resources of saying the problem with us is them. Is it really because we have an issue with them, or is we are creating an issue with them as a pretext to deprive them of scarce goods, services, and resources, which is not very nice.
Don't be so polite. Don't be so polite. Jump in.
But what you're basically saying also was a rhetoric that was used for colonization. It's the problem with them, right? There was the problem with them. They weren't enlightened. They weren't educated, right? They were in a dark continent, and that ultimately led to the deprivation of their own resources, right? Their own ability to build their own infrastructure. So I don't think we should even lead with that them, the problem with them, right? I think when I think when looking at it, I think looking at an issue and not necessarily and separating the individual sort of from the people from the issue or them. I'm not sure who's them.
What I was trying to say is that identifying a them, those people are the problem. It's a pretext to deprive them of their resources.
Yeah, I understand that. So it's the othering. Yeah, it's basically saying the othering. They are less than human. So which again was the pretext for colonization. They did not have the intelligence to build their own infrastructure. All of the diamonds and the gold and the oil reservoirs that you have, why didn't you develop it? We're gonna develop it, right? And we're gonna extract that and sort of and enrichen ourselves with it. So that has been done for many, many years, and we call that sort of the othering. You are less than human, right? And so by making that individual the problem or those group of people less than human, you assert yourself some form of control or superiority, and then you start making decisions that are not in their best interest, but you believe it's in their best interest because for some reason you are more superior than them. So you're thinking for them, you're acting for them. And again, you're not reflecting that that's still not in their best interest. And that has happened, I think, for, across the board.
Okay, another question, please. Christian. Grenada. Yeah.
The other is, can you reflect a little bit on the concept of collective rights, specifically with respect to the Native Americans and how they are being treated here, despite what their rights are all over there. And then the third one is the issue of what's the role of corporations, and I'm specifically saying that because here in Philadelphia we had a guy called Sullivan, who developed the Sullivan Principle, and a whole bunch of corporations very held accountable about what they've been doing right. And some of them have taken it to heart. And I wonder if there's any role that will go forward, because this is an ongoing process for corporations in the global market.
Okay, we got 3 questions. Yeah, a remark about Grenada. Yes.
Yeah, I'll touch on that one just quickly by just simply saying I think corporations have a role to play. They are clearly, for better or for worse, a bigger actor in all aspects of life. That does not absolve governments of doing what they need to do, right? And so to the degree that there is a partnership, one, that needs to be transparent, and it doesn't absolve the governments of its obligations. And so we can't just sort of look to corporations. I forgot your question before that. It's collective rights,
Yes,
right?
collective rights.
You know, I mean, I think what's interesting and the appeal of the human rights, one of the appeals of the human rights framework, distinct from the U.S. civil rights legal system, back in when I felt like that was a legal system that meant something more than it does today, at least. The U.S. civil rights system is based on my rights as opposed to your rights, right? So when you look at litigating non-discrimination cases, you can only prove non-discrimination if you're being treated worse than somebody else who is not of your same gender, not of your same national origin, right? And when I was a farm worker attorney and the entire workforce in the poultry processing industry was Guatemalan and they were being discriminated against, I didn't have a case because there was no one similarly situated who was getting treated better, right? and so that was highly problematic, right? And the limiting of sort of the intent to discriminate versus the impact, the impact of discrimination. And so the notion of the human rights and the principle of equality and non-discrimination as it applies to all people, right? And the notion that you don't have to prove that I am worse off than you, right? But that as a person, right? And that allows for a lot more cohesiveness, right? It allows for a lot more opportunity in the universal periodic review and the treaty review processes. And again, sort of, I don't want to be the Debbie Downer of this night, right? There is a lot of value to those international mechanisms as an opportunity to bring people together who often operate in their silos to recognize that the individual is nothing without the community, right? The individual is nothing without the collective, which is a principle that I think is espoused in the Native American and indigenous communities, right? In recognizing their communal rights. And then it goes to other issues around sovereignty, right? And what are their sovereign rights and how can they assert those?
Really quickly about a global market. Multinational corporations do play a very big role in human rights. Some of them have even been at the forefront of human rights violations. John Pilger has a wonderful documentary called New Rulers of the World. And basically in that documentary, he makes the argument that these corporations are as big as governments. We know that governments have been sort of advertising that they are really for sale, that come and have your manufacturing company in our country. Because of lacks of labor laws, right, the suppression of union organizations, if everyone was to look at their tags on their clothing here and just look at the tag of where they're made. Just do that exercise, and then go home and just Google that country and the human rights violations of where your clothing that we buy here in the United States, but is manufactured outside the world. You'll have an understanding of the role multinational corporations do play. So when we talk about lax of labor laws, when we talk about young women, 14 years old, 15 years old, working 16 hours in many of these sweatshops to manufacture some of the best things that we all have on here now, we cannot ignore the role that they play in reaffirming human rights and also weakening our plight to ensure that people's rights are protected, and also governments who go in cahoots with them and make these backroom deals that make their countries sort of accessible and available, and create atmospheres where multinational corporations can do what they want as long as they are uplifting their citizens out of poverty by paying them 70 cents an hour, right? But it's still slave labor. It's still human rights violations that we are witnessing. So multinational corporations do have a huge role in playing. And that's when we talk about corporate social responsibility. And we hope that they're all upholding what we call corporate social responsibility.
And I'll just take the long view again, that the whole issue of the evolution of these things needs to constantly be kept in mind. We have lots of laws in the United States, in this city, that we think are really important. Do people break those laws? Yeah, every day. So, but we still have them because they need to be enforced. And the same principle applies at the global level, except it's a heck of a lot harder, but it needs to be done.
Okay, I got a lot of questions and only really time for one or two. So how about if we do this? I'm going to let everybody state their question real quickly, please, and we'll have the panel just respond kind of in group, please.
Bob, you mentioned all these opportunities we have, and one of them was refugees. And how do we do that under the current political environment?
Okay, that's one. We had one over here. Yes.
Does the human rights community have a position on the death penalty?
Okay, death penalty, please.
How do we, in light of all of the conspiracy theories regarding, like, people spreading fake stories about the UN Army and all these other ridiculous things, how do we restore Americans' faith in international institutions when people are sharing these Facebook stories about, like, a UN Army getting ready to march to take people's guns and stuff like that? How do we restore faith?
Okay, and the young lady, yes.
How do we shape the message for young people? Because these documents we hold up as shining examples for our students. What's happening is they're seeing like a disengagement in the global process, because on the news they're hearing, well, we're out of the Paris Treaty and we're out of CPC. Why do we continue a relationship with NATO? And why are we funding UN? So on one hand, teachers and classrooms are saying, like, this is the high achievements of the last century. But on the other hand, they're hearing on the news, hearing different conversations, questioning everything that we say about it. And it's filtering into their conversations and how they interact in the classroom and how they interact online, which is creating a lot of havoc in communities.
Quick on the refugee one, basically I can just tell you, and in the handout I've given you a couple of organizations, High SPA and Nationality Service Center, and there's others in town, New Sanctuary Movement, that are political, but to work with them, those agencies as a volunteer and or donate or both, to me is the quickest response. And also let it be known that we have a terrific Office of Immigration Affairs here in Philadelphia, which has a tremendously positive global view. Miriam Enriquez is the director. Those folks are people you can, as an individual, ally with and help in any number of ways.
Yes.
So quickly on I mean, I think on all of them, rhetoric does matter, right? And language matters, and being willing to sort of engage. And when somebody says illegal immigrant, right, versus an immigrant, or a person, right, or my neighbor, or my fellow student, right, or whatever it is, right? I mean, it's helpful to just keep reminding people that people are people. And remind our members of Congress and engage at the local level. You see a lot of really exciting work happening at the local level. So the mayor's office, right, on immigrant affairs, but the human relations commissions and other ways in which folks, and there really is a growing movement in the sort of bringing human rights home movement to connect the international human rights treaties and to get cities to ratify. I mean, one of my pet projects that I would love to see take off is for the city of Philadelphia to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The United States has ratified it, but when we have a death penalty case where there is clear racial bias, or you have the Supreme Court saying this violates the Vienna Convention, the state of Texas says, who's the ICC, who's the UN, who's the State Department, which sent them the letter saying we have a decision from an international tribunal that says you can't execute this person. And so and then the federal government is like, well, federalism, we can't do anything, right? So there is a growing movement in response to the crisis of domestic violence to get cities and localities to ratify or to pass resolutions on domestic violence that incorporate provisions from the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, from CEDAW. And so thinking about sort of how can we bridge those international treaties and that language and just bring it directly, bypass what's going on at the federal level right now, and bring it directly into our communities where we have receptive politicians, receptive council people, receptive communities. And, hopefully we will get past this moment in our history. And then we'll be able to I'm calling it the sandwich effect of human rights, right? We've got this layer up here, we got really good bread here, we got really good bread down here, and eventually the filling won't matter anymore, or we'll sort of, we'll get new filling and it'll be okay. But finding a way to
I was looking because I know in the UDHR it addresses death penalty. Yeah, so I know it's somewhere in this booklet, but I think they try to move towards countries abolishing the death penalty. But if you were to use the death penalty, you would have to be 18 and older. Of course, death penalty cannot be used for children. And in terms of your question, when you talked about young people, I think in my students, and I teach a number of courses, but even in my global politics course, a lot of my students don't believe that the UN works. They said, well, there's all of these issues going around the world, so what is the UN really doing? And I tried to explain to them that the UN is not a magic pill, right, to solving all of the world's problems, right? But what it does is that it helps us, right, in identifying and engaging people and promoting human rights in the effort to hopefully solve some of the world's problems, and that's still moving the marker. I think also with young people, I think getting them more engaged. So I think even for my students, sometimes I take them to trips to the UN. Many of them have never been in the UN. They've never probably even been on the block, because they say, what does it concern me, right? As a young person, what is it that I can possibly add to such a big institution? And I think that there is space for them. That is the whole point of what we're doing, so that the next generation can correct some of the things that we've gotten wrong. Right? And by allowing them to understand that their voice matters, I can never push them who to vote for, but I can push them to exercise their civic responsibility. Just how we can push them to engage in these institutions. And that will also help us on the other end of having politicians and policymakers listen to young people, right? I'm sometimes almost confused as to why politicians don't necessarily campaign at college campuses, because why? They don't think young people probably vote. And if they did, right, and if they raised their voice, I think there would be a shift on some of the things that they talk about, of what concerns and what are the concerns or the needs of young people, right? And I think that's extremely important. So by getting them engaged, having them understand that the UN is not necessarily a magic pill, but it's a step in the right direction by addressing many of the issues that we're facing in the world, I think we'll better be able to prepare the next generation of young people to be ethical and moral leaders in our world.
And the young man in the back asked about, essentially, I think, the problem of fake news, which to me is maybe among the most scariest things to emerge.
About the UN.
Right. But things that are hyped up and then sent out on social media. And I mean, I guess two responses that are inadequate. One is there is a movement around an internet Bill of Rights as we speak that's beginning around people being able to delve into the sources of things. And anyway, it's out there, and I think it's a good development. And I guess, the other thing, which is escaping me at this second, is another response that I had for that problem. The irony of human rights that the original speaker tonight talked about. When something comes out and you haven't heard about it before, and all of a sudden, and it's very upsetting, but the fact that it's emerging is good. So the fact that we now at least know what the heck, or something, a lot more about what went on social media, even though it's really painful and scary, is better than if we didn't know it. And hopefully we can move forward. Yeah.
So let me just sum up by saying that we are grateful to our speakers, and we're grateful to 70 years of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is certainly one of the reasons why, as Bob said, if you asked people not knowing who they were, what their station in life would be, that they would choose now compared to other times in human history. But this discussion makes clear, let's just hope that when your grandchildren and others 70 years from now look, they would choose then, and that it would be better than now. Thank you. Good night.